In this story, we are visiting the Netherlands, which is facing exactly these national political challenges. It's a climate-vulnerable country with centuries-long history of managing a fraught relationship with nature. It's also a wealthy country, one of the richest in the world, and has a record of taking bold climate action. But even the Netherlands is finding the politics of climate change difficult. Let's hear from my colleague Stinja in the Dutch countryside.
This is the Maaslandkering, one of the big infrastructural designs to keep the Netherlands dry. It is also the region where I live, the typical Dutch polder landscape of canals and fields, dikes and windmills. It's also the region that hosts world-class industries, innovative water infrastructures such as these massive locks behind me, and highly efficient farms that make this actually tiny country the second largest agricultural exporter in the world. But this landscape is being threatened by climate change, and not just because of the potential of sea level rise. Because the Netherlands also has some of Europe's great rivers running through these countries, like the Rhine and the Maas. Part of the country is actually a massive delta of connected rivers. And in June 2021, we came very close to important inundations in the south of the country because of a massive rainfall that turned even secondary rivers into an angry flood. The Dutch know how vulnerable this country is, and we know that climate change matters. So the Dutch has therefore been at the forefront of climate action and climate adaptation. And we figured out how the shift to a low-carbon economy brings opportunities like clean air, cheap energy, new industries and jobs. But recently, we've also seen a backlash against climate and nature protection actions, just as we've seen it in other countries in Europe and around the world. Because ordinary people who are struggling with inflation and high fuel costs, they are concerned that they will not be able to afford climate action, such as house insulation or heat pumps. Over the last few years, hundreds of farmers have driven their giant tractors onto the streets around the Dutch Parliament in The Hague, just 20 kilometers away from where I'm standing now. They were there to make sure their voices and their fears are being heard. Many voters here and elsewhere in Europe are now considering such issues when they take part in elections. There is a new political dimension. It's not that most people don't believe that climate change is taking place. What's happening now is that governments are making political choices about how they are going to fulfill their promises about reaching net zero. How they are going to make this historic systemic shift to economies running on clean energy. But the facts are very clear. Avoiding a worsening climate crisis is better on all accounts. But how to connect that to the challenges of today and across different groups that do not all benefit equally? That is why the first story in WRI's Stories to Watch 2024 is about climate change, about the measures we need if we're to try to get near to 1.5 degrees of global warming, and about the backlash against climate action.
The story Stinja just outlined is playing out around the world. In 2024, voters will make choices that will determine how climate policy will look like in their countries. These choices are going to quite literally shape the future of our planet. Most importantly, each country will have to ensure that this transition is fast enough and at the same time fair. Wealthy nations like Germany or the UK need to manage challenges like changing energy prices or new farming practices. Developing countries need to rapidly transition the energy system so they can benefit from low-carbon growth. And fossil fuel producers like Norway, Saudi Arabia, or the United States have to find other sources of prosperity in a low-carbon world. If the world is going to exponentially accelerate the needed transition, we need leaders to develop a new climate politics that emphasizes the opportunities, but also identifies and assists those who will find the transition more difficult. The new climate economy research finds that strong climate action can lead up to 65 million good jobs by 2030. But the jobs will change. The industries we know now will be disrupted, and many will worry how this impacts them. These issues will look different in every country. But there are two crucial developments to watch for. First, what role will climate policy play domestically when voters go to poll? And how will candidates frame the benefit of the new climate economy? And second, how will elected leaders prioritize support for other countries' climate action? Let's look at examples of how this is playing out domestically in different countries. First, the United States recently passed 3 laws that make up the biggest package of climate legislation in its history. The Inflation Reduction Act, the centerpiece climate legislation, was designed and presented as an initiative to create jobs, make the US economy more competitive, and reduce inflation. It promised to create 9 million jobs in just 10 years. It also promised to spend 40 cents of every dollar on vulnerable and low-income communities to ensure that this transition is just. In this critical election year, the world will be watching how candidates position the economic opportunities and cost of climate action to voters. Will the promise of the new climate economy and a safer world engage voters, or will they fear what the transition means for them? Second, Indonesia. Indonesia has negotiated $20 billion just economy transition partnership with 9 wealthy countries and the EU that promises to shift its economy away from fossil fuel dependence. It has also reduced its primary forest loss by 64% in recent years. The current president strives to position Indonesia as a climate leader of the world. In the final stretch of this election season, will the candidates embrace this agenda and present a vision for stronger climate action? Will these policies continue under the new administration? In all these elections, leaders need to ensure that the benefits of the transition are spread widely. One of the biggest reasons we are seeing a backlash is that people feel they may be left behind. We will be watching to see if leaders pledge support to workers, providing retraining and compensation packages, and ensuring that they can take advantage of the new clean energy jobs. These elections are not only important domestically, but they're also important for multilateral processes. Elected leaders, especially in wealthy countries, will face the significant additional challenge of allocating substantially more resources to support emerging economies. This is a fair expectation and is part of the Paris Agreement. For example, vulnerable countries face devastating climate-related damages, and the $700 million in early pledges for loss and damage fund is just a drop in the ocean compared to $580 billion these countries will need by 2030. Climate action, including energy transition, will not happen in emerging countries at the speed and scale necessary without significantly more support from wealthy countries. This will come to a head in November when 198 countries gather in Azerbaijan for the next COP to agree to how much money wealthy countries are willing to put on the table for emerging countries. Delivering on this won't be easy, as the richest countries themselves face their own economic challenges and increasing cost of conflict and migration. At the UN summit, watch to see how countries with very different priorities find common ground on what is needed and how much can be delivered. The decisions made at the ballot box this year will determine whether the world can stay within a 1.5 degree of warming. We need to see a new politics of climate, and 2024 will play a decisive role in what the future holds.